Wedding season is in full bloom, and if you've been wanting a straighter smile, look no further than Bite. Bite offers clear teeth aligners that help you transform your smile from the comfort of your home or wherever you'll be this time of year. Forget the endless trips to the dentist. Bite's clear aligners are doctor-directed and delivered straight to your doorstep. Just take an impression mold of your mouth, preview your 3D smile, and order your all-day or at-night aligners. Bite also knows that wedding season is expensive enough as it is. Their aligners cost thousands less than braces. It's time to let your smile shine. Get started on your smile journey by visiting Byte.com and use code WONDERY at checkout to get your at-home impression kit for only $14.95. That's BYTE.com, code WONDERY to get over 80% off your impression kit.
I suspect that most of us spend very little time thinking about the emotional lives of judges. Even when we see them on TV, they're these kind of remote figures sitting up on this elevated platform wearing robes. Maybe we're aware when Judge Judy's in a bad mood, but they, of course, do have emotional lives, and they're making incredibly important decisions. And I heard recently that there's a little bit of a movement in the judiciary to adopt mindfulness. And one of the guys who's kind of at the forefront of that is Jeremy Fogel, who's a senior United States district judge in the Northern District of California, who's currently serving as the director of the Federal Judicial Center in Washington, D.C., which is an education wing of the judiciary. They basically do education for judges. And he's a meditator, and he's trying to get other judges to do it. And so I give you Jeremy Fogel. From ABC, this is the 10% Happier Podcast. I'm Dan Harris. I always ask everybody the same first question, which is, how and why did you start meditating?
Well, it was about 20 years ago. I think it was just my wife and I were both interested in kind of developing more ways of centering ourselves and making our lives more reflective. And so we actually got involved in mindfulness meditation and in yoga right about the same time. We took some classes.
So it didn't have anything to do with being a judge?
No. Well, I mean, being a judge had a lot to do with it in the sense that I felt that my job put me under a lot of stress. And that it required a lot of complex decision-making. And I was looking for a way of getting some space and centering myself. And I had studied meditation in a different context. I was a religious studies major in college. I was really interested in those subjects. I studied Eastern religion, so I was aware of Zen. I was aware of meditation in that context, but I'd never done it. I mean, it wasn't a practice that I had, but the idea of having a practice that kind of gave me a way of getting space, it was something I sort of intuitively made sense to me. So it was something that when we kind of decided together to do this, it was with some enthusiasm, and yoga really has, which I've also done pretty much since then, has had the same effect. And I've kind of chosen. I like yin yoga. I like the restorative, reflective, not so much the athletic stuff, and more the opportunity to really use it for deep relaxation. So I took a mindfulness meditation class. It was the John Kabat-Zinn 8-week program. Thought it was great and continued doing it. It was just it was something that made sense. It came pretty naturally, and just never have stopped. I mean, I think in terms of my consistency, that's really varied depending on what else has been going on in my life. But I've always found some time to meditate.
Every day?
No, not every day. That's why I say the consistency has varied. I mean, there have been times where I've meditated every day. There have been times when I've meditated 2 or 3 times a week. I think I'm more in that latter category now. But one of the things that's happened is that it's less formal and more like I'll find moments in my life, like I'll be at work and I'll notice I'm a little bit off center, and I'll close the door to my office and I'll take 5 minutes. That I'm doing more of that rather than having a kind of a structured practice of sitting for a certain number of minutes a day.
What do you say I'm feeling off center? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think one of the benefits of having meditated is that I have a sense of equanimity. I have a sense of where I want to be. I'm present. I'm in the moment to a fairly good degree. And there are times when things happen. Either I'm very tired, or there's something that's happened in my life that's upsetting or distracting, and I just notice I'm not feeling that way. I'm not not feeling the equanimity. I'm feeling more emotional than I normally do, or I'm feeling more anxious than I usually do, or something doesn't feel lined up with where I usually am. I mean, I think that's been one of the effects of having done this for a long time, is I have a place that I am most of the time that feels quite stable and where I'm happy being.
And how back in 1996, how long did it take for you to start feeling more centered, to use your word?
Oh, quite a while. I mean, when I talk to people about meditation now, I say, it's very, very slow growth. It's not like you start doing it and a week later, your life is completely different. That it's a very gradual process. And there's a story that I tell when I talk about meditation to people is I think I had done a couple of the 8-week classes, and I was waiting at a red light near my home, and it was a long light. It was a small street feeding into a big street, and I was looking at the light, and I said to my wife, I said, that light is really red. That there was like some way that I noticed, that I was just more aware of the situation I was in, and I think that's when I started to notice that it was having an impact. But to really get to this, and I really describe it as a sense of equanimity, that's taken years, and I think it's just the process of constantly coming back to a place where I can feel things very intensely. It's not like I don't feel things, but that they don't stick. That I can just notice that they're there and let them go.
What was you said your job at the time was pretty stressful. I know you've kind of switched jobs a little bit, which we'll get into in a second, but your job at the time was you were on the district court in the Northern District.
Actually, it was right before that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I was still on the state court.
Gotcha.
It's called the Superior Court in California, and I was that's the general jurisdiction court for the state. I was doing complex civil cases, and I was also doing some fairly heavy criminal cases. And the state courts do most of the major felonies. And so I had a number of cases in that job that really were quite demanding. They were emotionally demanding, physically demanding. And then right about that time, actually, right around the time I started doing meditation, I was nominated for the district court. And that, people follow judicial nominations. They know that it's a stressful process, a lot of politics, and there was then, there is now, and so the process of being vetted for that position and having my background check and coming out to D.C. and going to the Senate hearings and all of that, that was actually quite stressful. In addition to my day job, I had to deal with that, and it was great actually having something that I could use as a refuge from that.
So 1996 is well before this became a corporate phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon, an athletic phenomenon.
Right.
You were ahead of the curve here. So did you tell anybody you worked with that you were doing this thing?
I met another judge right around that time and I don't even remember how it was that we discovered we were both meditators, and actually she'd been doing it longer than I had. But I've always done a lot of judicial education. I mean, it's how I got to my present job, which we'll talk about. But I was teaching state judges in California, and they were primarily dealing with judges who were doing family and juvenile cases, which anybody who's been a judge will tell you are probably the hardest cases to do. I mean, you'd think it would be a murder case or something like that, but actually the ones that really demand the most of you in terms of emotional intensity and just trying to keep your head, if you sort of get a contested child custody case or you get a juvenile dependency case. And I was teaching a class that was basically about coping strategies, how to do cases like that and maintain your equilibrium, not impose your personal biases on them. I mean, really try to handle them in a thoughtful way. And so people talked about how hard the cases were, how demanding they were. And we were saying, well, what can you do to deal with that? And, there are various ways to reduce stress. And one of the judges who was in the class volunteered that she meditated. And I think it was part of her religious tradition. She was Buddhist, and she was part of her religious practice. But, then we talked afterwards, and, I said, well, I do that too, but it wasn't something that one kind of went out and broadcast. It was definitely sort of viewed as an alternative kind of practice, alternative way of living.
And so now obviously you're pretty open about it.
Yeah.
So what changed?
Well, I think the world changed. I think people really, one of the things that I like about mindfulness meditation is that its origins are completely secular, that it was something that was discovered in kind of helping people deal with chronic pain. And not discovered, but the application was for people with chronic pain. And another sort of personal path for me is I used to have every spring I would get really bad hay fever. I was allergic to various kinds of pollen in the San Francisco Bay Area where I lived, and April and May were just torture for me. And I actually was able to desensitize myself through meditation. I don't get those allergies anymore. So it's it sounds like one of these miraculous things, but it really wasn't. It was just noticing that there was an emotional component to my allergic reaction, and it had something to do with that, and something to do with my how run down my immune system was. And so I was able to notice that, and then I was able to do things to take care of myself, and over time it went away. So I think a lot of people have had experiences like that. I think a lot of people have either been able to deal with chronic pain, they've been able to deal with chronic stress or various kinds of illnesses. And then there's all of the performance enhancement stuff that's happened, you mentioned in the corporate world and in the military, that people learn that actually centering yourself and calming your mind can make you work more effectively and be able to think more clearly and deal with stressful tasks more accurately. One of the military folks I've been working with lately is a fighter pilot, and she trains people to fly supersonic aircraft, and it's just really interesting to hear her talk about mindfulness, because it's like nothing could be sort of a more immediate thing than having to navigate at that kind of speed, and just really having some additional bandwidth, which is one of the things you get from meditation, I think. And I think that's what's been discovered in the corporate world, and that's why. And in athletics, that's the other. I didn't mention that, but that's the other place where there's been several professional sports teams, successful ones that are where that's part of their training. So it's been interesting to see that happen.
And then there are the New York Knicks, not
so
successful,
not
but
so
they do
successful.
meditate.
No, I was thinking of the Golden State Warriors.
Yes, well, right.
But,
also the Bulls and the Lakers,
right.
Who came before the Knicks in terms of Phil Jackson's career.
Right.
But first of all, I love the term extra bandwidth. That's really cool. So you went from being a state court to a federal court district judge to now moving. You now have moved from Northern California to Washington, D.C., and this actually has a pertinence to meditation that we'll get to, but just so that we can follow the chronology here. And so your current job is what?
Well, so there's an agency called the Federal Judicial Center, which is actually a statutory agency. It was set up by Congress 50 years ago. And it has two primary purposes. One is to do policy research for the federal judiciary so that we can advise the policymakers, like the Chief Justice and the Judicial Conference of the United States, on best practices and how to manage the courts. Not what kind of decisions they should make, but how the courts ought to be set up and managed, and how the workload ought to be managed. And then the other major mission is educating all of the people who work in the judicial branch. So it's all of the judges at every level, plus all of the administrative staff, the clerks of court and the probation and pretrial officers and everybody else who works for the courts. So we actually have a fairly large constituency. And I think one way of thinking about the FJC, that's what we're known as, Federal Judicial Center, is it's kind of like a university within the judiciary, which has the traditional functions of a university. We do a lot of research, and we do a lot of teaching. And so I was selected to be the director of that 5 years ago, and that's what caused me to move to D.C.
And in that role, you actually did an interesting thing, which was you published. Well, I'll let you tell.
Well, so I've been the last 5 years that I've been there. I've been kind of been slowly trying to think through a modern curriculum for judges, and I think when I talk to members of the public, they usually think, well, you're learning about the law, and actually that's a relatively small part of what I mean when I talk about a curriculum for judges, because under our system, most of the people who become federal judges are very accomplished lawyers before they become judges, and that's kind of how they get to be judges. So they know the law pretty well when they get there, and what they need in that respect is updates, and if there are new developments, they need an opportunity to get that, and if there's an area they didn't get in their practice, then we need to offer that component. But primarily what people need is they need education about how to do the job, that you're in a very different position when you're a judge than you were as a lawyer. You're not an advocate. You have to be a neutral. You deal with a very wide variety of cases. You might be an expert on environmental law and know nothing about criminal law, or you might know something about one particular culture, your own usually, and not anything about somebody else's. There are ways to communicate. How do you write a good opinion? How do you make a good oral ruling so that people not only feel that you've been fair, but that you feel heard and understood? So there's a lot of skills that go with the job that people don't necessarily know when they come to the job. And then there are some parts of the job that are quite challenging emotionally. Sentencing is the one that people always mention, that when you're sentencing people in a criminal case, it sometimes can be very heart-wrenching, when you're sending someone to prison for a long time, and you see their family in the courtroom, and you realize you're not just punishing somebody for committing a crime, but you're also separating them from their family, and their spouses or their kids don't necessarily have any culpability, and yet they're suffering too. Or you have victims of crime who've suffered terribly, and you have to deal with their situation. So there's a lot of emotional stress around sentencing. And so a lot of what our job is to figure out how to help judges deal with those things. And at some point after working on this curriculum for a long time, I've been thinking about this over the years that I've been there, that mindfulness actually has something to contribute in this area. And so I wrote a very short article about some of the ways that mindfulness can be applied to the work that judges do. And up till now, you might see this at a judge's workshop. It's a health and wellness thing. It's a way of reducing stress, just like running or other kinds of exercise. So there's been some mention of it there, but there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to how mindfulness practice could actually help you with the job itself. And that's what I wanted to talk about.
And you were a little nervous about doing it.
I was definitely nervous about doing it because even though, as you suggested in an earlier question, mindfulness has become more mainstream, it's not so mainstream in the judiciary. And I've always been a little self-conscious of the fact that I'm from Northern California. I was worried that people would stereotype me as being from the land of the counterculture, and I really did not want it to be taught that way. I didn't want it to be perceived that way. It seemed to me that it's a tool, along with all the other tools we try to equip people with, but it's a tool that has some very specific applications to judicial work. And so what I talked about in the article were three things. One was that it helps you deal with repetitive tasks in a more thoughtful way. And again, for people who aren't familiar with the courts, one thing, all judges do certain things over and over again. If you're presiding over a criminal calendar, you'll take a certain number of guilty pleas every week. If you are a bankruptcy judge, you will have so many dozens of hearings with debtors to confirm their plans every week. If you're a magistrate judge, you'll have bail hearings, many of them in the course of a week. And those functions actually are very, very repetitive. That if you've been a judge for a long time, they start to take on a sameness to them. for the people who are in court, however, it may be the only case they have. It may be the only contact they're ever going to have with the court. Hopefully, if it's a criminal case, it is the only contact they're ever going to have. And so it's a really big deal to them. But what happens to us with the repetition is it feels very routine. And I think one of the ways mindfulness can really be helpful is sort of the notion that you approach every moment anew. You approach it with a beginner's mind. And that construct, I think, has been very helpful to me, and I think it's very helpful to others too. It's the idea that, maybe I've taken I haven't counted how many guilty pleas I've taken, but I've been a judge for 35 years. I've probably taken thousands of guilty pleas. But sort of the notion that this is the first one I've ever taken, kind of thinking about it that way or approaching it that way. And that not only helps me see more and take in more. Kind of go back to my red light example. I'm seeing more texture and more in the whole situation. But what it's communicating to the defendant or to the other people in the courtroom is that I'm really there, and I'm really present, and I'm not just sort of processing something. So I think that's one of the ways that practicing mindfulness can help judges do their jobs better. And then another thing, and it's a big deal these days because our country is becoming so much more diverse, is cultural awareness. That it's real easy to, especially if you're under stress and you're really busy, to just assume that when somebody does something, it has a particular meaning. And so the example I give in the article is making eye contact. And as most of us in the U.S., we kind of think eye contact is a sign that somebody's being truthful with us. I mean, it's the way we're wired to see it that way. Well, I've learned from some of my international work that there are parts of the world where people just don't look at you. Looking at you is actually an act of hostility. You wouldn't do that unless you knew somebody very well. So you can't fill in the gaps of culture if somebody doesn't know that there's a cultural difference. But what I think being more mindful allows you to do is to not make assumptions about things. That you see somebody relating to you in a particular way, and you don't just assume that what they're doing has a particular meaning. That you have a more non-judgmental approach to the interaction.
What about unconscious racial bias? I mean, aren't there discrepancies here in the way sentences are meted out?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's, unconscious racial bias is a huge topic in judicial education. It's a huge topic in the judiciary. And, as I've said many times, I don't know that I've ever met a judge who didn't want to be fair. I mean, it's kind of like it's a basic job description, But there are ways we can be unfair unconsciously, and it's a hard one to get at because, what do you mean I'm being unfair unconsciously? If I'm trying to be fair and I'm doing my best to be fair, what do you mean I'm not being fair? And so there's I think a natural defensiveness people feel sometimes, and I think one of the things that slowing down your mind and being more mindful allows you to do is to allow for the possibility that you are looking at the situation through your own lens, which I think, in fact, we are. But it allows you to do that with less resistance. I guess it comes with the territory. As you become more mindful, you realize that what I'm seeing, what I think I'm seeing, is what I'm seeing. It's not necessarily what the other person is doing or experiencing. So you gain more space. I mean, I need to say here that it doesn't make up for lack of information. In other words, that if somebody's from a very different culture from you and you don't know anything about that culture, you could be the world's most mindful person and you still wouldn't know what you don't know about that culture. Mm-hmm. So I think there is an educational element when you're talking about bias that mindfulness doesn't get at. But I think it slows you down enough that you can allow for the possibility. One of the things that I really find helpful, there's a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he talks about System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. And System 1 is your sort of intuitive, reactive way of thinking. It's just it's your habits of mind, and And system 2 thinking is reflective thinking, where you actually think about the data you're taking in and you reflect about it. And what happens, particularly when you're in high-stress jobs, is you almost naturally track into system 1. And we all do it, and to some extent, we need to do it. I mean, you don't have time to think about, whether you're going to get run over by a car crossing the street. I mean, you see somebody coming at a high rate of speed, and you react to that. So our reactions serve a useful function, but sometimes they're wrong. And when you're in a job like I'm in, and my colleagues are in, where you're making decisions that really have impact on people's lives, slowing down your mind actually, I really believe, helps you do your job better. And I think it's true in the area of bias, along with many other things. You just don't react so quickly. You give yourself a little more time to be reflective. And then I think if you add to that the opportunity to get cross-cultural education, which we're really trying to do as well, just to get people to tell stories, to learn more about each other's life story, then you can combine those things, and I think you really can get at racial bias and other kinds of bias, gender bias. It's hard work, but I think I think mindfulness enhances it.
Huge issue. Huge issue.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Lindsey Graham, the host of Wondery's podcast, American Scandal. We bring to life some of the biggest controversies in U.S. history, events that have shaped who we are as a country and that continue to define the American experience. American Scandal tells marquee stories about American politics, like the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, an event that led to the downfall of a president and raised questions about the future of American democracy. We go behind the scenes looking at devastating financial crimes, like the fraud committed at Enron and Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. And we tell stories of complicated public figures like Edward Snowden and Monica Lewinsky, people who found themselves thrust into the spotlight and who spurred debates about the future of the country. Follow American Scandal wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen ad-free on the Amazon Music or Wondery app.
In the first part of the 20th century, the Hilton family had a lock on the hotel industry by offering upscale service at a modest price. The company was expanding fast and buying up iconic properties across the country, like the Plaza and the Waldorf Astoria. But their unchallenged rise wouldn't last. An ambitious Mormon named J.W. Marriott decides to pivot from restaurants to hospitality, and he's after Hilton's business, developing modern hotels across the world. But both the Hilton and Marriott families will have to contend with their share of drama in finding a successor, while also fighting to stay solvent in a high-stakes business. Hi, I'm David Brown, the host of Wondery's show Business Wars. We go deep into some of the biggest corporate rivalries of all time. In our latest season, Hilton and Marriott are in a race to expand globally and secure the loyalty of fickle customers. Make sure to follow Business Wars wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen ad-free on the Amazon Music or Wondery app.
So how did that article go over, and is mindfulness taking off in the judiciary?
Yeah. Before I answer that question, I just want to say there's one other point I wanted to make. There's a third point which is important, and I think it's important I make it before I answer your question, because I think this is the one that people really relate to, which is the emotional. There's a psychological term for it, emotional regulation. So somebody does something that upsets you, and so you talk with judges around the world, not just around the country. You talk with judges around the world. Bad lawyers upset us. Unreasonable parties upset us. Dumb cases upset us. There are certain pet peeves that I think judges all have, and it's not uncommon that if it gets really bad, you respond to that. You show your emotion. You react. You are cross with somebody, or you yell at them, or you are discourteous to them, or you somehow communicate your displeasure in some way. And sometimes that's really not appropriate. I mean, it's not, you lose that sense of judicial demeanor that everybody kind of hopes for when they come to court. So one of the arguments that I make in the article, and it certainly has been true for me, is that having more bandwidth, as I said earlier, having more space allows me to have more equanimity, so I can notice It's not that I don't get irritated. I do. But I notice that I'm irritated before I express the irritation. I notice it, and I have a little more time to say, oh, this lawyer is really starting to make me mad. And so and then I can say, well, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to ignore it? Am I going to take a recess? Am I going to say something to the lawyer? But if I say something to the lawyer, I want it to be considered and dignified and modulated and so on. So you have more room to do that, I think, as a result of a mindfulness practice.
Right. Respond, not react. We talk about it all the time.
That's right. That's right. So, and I might mention, my wife has been a preschool teacher for many years, and so she worked with 2-year-olds. And
is that harder or easier than dealing with lawyers?
Well, I think there's similarities. I mean, and I don't mean to disrespect either lawyers or 2-year-olds. But I mean, it's like there are real challenges in working with young children, and I think she would say that she gained a lot more equanimity as well. And just had a lot more patience, and was able to just take it as it came. And
I know I asked a question earlier that we then had to set aside because you wanted to list this third thing. But so now I'm going to even take us further down the tributary. It strikes me sitting with you that I don't know that members of the public empathize with or think much about judges. Yes, Judge Judy's a huge figure in our culture or whatever, but I don't know. Like when I'm watching a courtroom drama, the person I'm least drawn to in the frame is the judge.
Right.
I'm thinking about the lawyer. It's all about the lawyers and the defendant.
Oh, that's right. And in fact, our Chief Justice once said, the judge is sort of the umpire. No one goes to the game to see the umpire.
Right.
I think in a trial, that the umpire analogy is actually very good. I mean, it's a little different for appellate judges because they are making legal policy kinds of decisions. But as a trial judge, which I've been my whole career, you really don't want to be the story. But at the same time, you are, in a way, you're kind of a symbol of the legitimacy of the entire system. This is another thing I've written about. It's a different article, but we don't have a state religion. We don't have we have a very polarized country politically. I mean, particularly now, but I mean, we have at other times in our history as well. But one thing that people generally accept is the idea of the rule of law. We accept the legitimacy of the courts. When the 2000 presidential election, when the Supreme Court decided who was going to be president, it in some countries there would have been a revolution, but it didn't happen here. A lot of people didn't like the decision, but people accepted the decision, and I think we're very fortunate, and I say this as somebody who's done a lot of international travel. We're very fortunate that our courts are as respected as they are. One of the reasons that the courts are respected is I think we have a very professional judiciary. I think people really take it seriously. Most of the judges I've had the privilege of working with take the job very seriously. And so we're symbols of the institution, and I think in order to really do that job as well as we can, we need a number of things. I mean, it doesn't hurt to be smart. It doesn't hurt to be efficient. It doesn't hurt to be brave. It doesn't hurt to be compassionate. But I think having the ability to be self-aware is a very important part of it too. And I think it's more important now than it's ever been because of the things I was talking about, because of the diversity of society, and because, this in some ways I think the courts are the glue that holds our society together sometimes. And so judges need to be, they need to be on their game. They need to be thoughtful, reflective, as fair as they can be. And I really think mindfulness is a terrific tool. It's not the only tool, but I think it's a terrific tool, and it's well suited to what we do. So you asked earlier what the reaction has been. Very interesting. I was nervous when I put the article out, and what I found was a lot of people related to it. I got a lot of unsolicited feedback from people, and not just people on the coast. I mean, I got emails from people in Alabama and Indiana and places like that. I mean, there was just sort of this sense of a lot of people around the country either having a practice or being interested in it and feeling like something like that was something that would enhance their lives. So I just this summer spoke at two. They're called circuit conferences. They're gatherings of the judges and lawyer representatives from the different regions of the country. So we spoke at the Ninth Circuit and the Tenth Circuit.
Yeah, I think I was supposed to go to one of them, and I was too busy to go.
Yeah, both of them are in the West. The Ninth Circuit is the Western Coast and some of the inland states, and then the Tenth Circuit is the rest of the inland mountain states, and then in Kansas and Oklahoma. And so we gave presentations, and then at the Tenth Circuit, we actually had a voluntary practice session the morning following the presentation. And I had no idea what was going to happen. I thought, we might get 3 people. We got over 30 judges.
Wow.
Yeah, from around the 10th Circuit, and they were really interested. They said, I can see where this would be useful to me or relevant to me, so we actually did a little practice, and we had some discussion afterwards. And then this summer, another program that I was involved in was in Oregon. It was a national workshop we did for court unit executives. So it's like essentially the clerks of court, people who run the clerk's offices in all of the federal courts, and the chiefs of the probation and pretrial offices around the country. And they work with the criminal defendants. And we had about 250 of those folks and did a mindfulness program for them, and then had a practice session the next morning, and had a really good turnout as well. And I think people just, they find it relatable. They say, I can see where one of the things I struggle with is, being, just having moods, being distracted by emotion, or being distracted by worries, and as people say, you're either in the past or you're in the future. Your mind is somewhere other than in the present, and that having a greater ability to be in the present really does enable you to do your job better. It isn't. I think the initial interest people had it was as a health thing. It was a way of reducing stress, which it's great as a health thing. It was how I got into it, but it has professional applications, and I think that's what's interesting. I think that's what's starting to be seen in a lot of different areas of life. And you mentioned. We talked about them earlier. Medicine's another one.
And the legal community. Law schools are teaching this now.
Exactly.
There are websites to
That's right.
Mindful Lawyer.
That's right.
I don't know if I'm getting that right. And in fact, I think I saw a website about dedicated to judges who are trying to spread mindfulness within the judiciary.
There's I think what it's probably one of the ones for the state judiciaries.
I see.
But yes, I'm aware that there are people doing that. And would like to actually link up with them. The National Judicial College, which is in some ways an organization that's similar to the one that I'm involved with, but it's an educational resource for judges of state courts. And it's, in addition, not all the states have really robust judicial education just for budget reasons. And so this is a national organization. It's a nonprofit that does judicial education. They're having a mindfulness retreat in, I think in November, 4 days. That they're getting people to out in Arizona.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Great.
So it's pretty interesting to see how it's becoming more mainstream. People are less embarrassed about it, I guess. And there's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's one of the things I always tell people is it's a totally natural process, and it's. Some people are interested in whether it's got any religious overtones or not, and I said, well, mindfulness per se doesn't, but you can look in almost any faith tradition and you can find it, that it's part of the practice in many of the great religions.
Yes, but there have been some lawsuits filed against public schools.
Yes. Yes.
Filed or threatened. The argument being that there are sectarian overtones. Do you have a view on that? It's going to bubble up to the courts.
Well, I think so, and I think you have to be very clear that that's not what we're talking about. I've seen those cases. In fact, a couple of them were in federal court. They thought, I think there was a yoga class, for in a school, and the salutation at the end of a yoga class, namaste, was a religious statement, and you could make an argument, because it comes from a Hindu tradition, but I think we're being very careful. I think it's funny how this comes up for me. It's not because to me it's completely secular, and always has been. But I have colleagues, judges will approach me who they themselves are, they have religious affiliation. They say, well, how is this different from prayer? How is this different from the contemplation that I do as part of my religion? And then we'll talk about it and say, well, no, actually, it's quite similar. It has many of the same elements. And so how you choose to do this is you really find your own comfort level. It's not like there's only one way to do it. But the thing that I think all mindfulness practices have in common is the being in the moment. It's having a practice that gets you in the moment.
But do you think there's a legally acceptable, constitutionally kosher way to get mindfulness into public schools?
I think so. I mean, I don't know how a court would view it, because it would depend on the particulars of the program.
Yeah, but you could do, if the programs were correct. You think it's possible?
Absolutely. Because I think if you do it correctly, it's got nothing to do with religion. I think the problem is that this is one of those areas where people have very strong opinions and very strong emotions. So someone could misread. I've been doing yoga for as long as I've been doing meditation, and it has absolutely no religious significance to me at all. It never has, But it's. I suppose if somebody wanted to see that in that way, I mean, they could make that argument. So I don't mean to minimize the possibility that somebody might see it that way, but I think if you teach mindfulness to a diverse audience in the right way, that there is no reason why it couldn't be part of a curriculum in a public school.
So give me a sense of I know you say that sometimes you practice every day, sometimes you don't, but when you do practice, what do you do? What kind of meditation? How long? What's the move?
It's variable. I mean, my optimal is 20 minutes. I just use bells. Don't use any kind of guidance.
Like actual bells that you're ringing personally, or on
I actually have a recording.
Okay.
I have a recording of bells, and they're kind of the very nice resonant bells that have long lingering sounds. And,
so you do a bell to start and a bell to end.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and other than that, it's just breathing.
So you mean you're feeling your breath coming in, going out, and then when you get distracted, you go back.
That's correct.
And that's it.
That's it.
And so that is the classic MBSR technique. And just to say a word about that, because you mentioned this was pioneered and it was pioneered by John Kabat-Zinn, who was
right.
I always forget if he was a micro or molecular biologist from MIT. Somebody corrected me on this on Twitter recently, and I obviously didn't take it in or wasn't being mindful when I read it. But anyway, John, phenomenal guy, started he was a Zen practitioner, but was also studying in the Theravadan tradition too at the Insight Meditation Society up in Barre, Massachusetts, and had a moment of insight while practicing on retreat that, hey, we could teach this, strip out all the Buddhist lingo and just teach it, because, the Buddhists describe mindfulness well, but they don't own it, just the same way that algebra was described very well by the Muslims in Baghdad or whatever back in the day, but, it is a universal phenomenon.
That's exactly right. And as I mentioned earlier, I studied Zen not as a practitioner, but as a student of religion many years ago. I actually did take a Zen meditation class. I think it was 8 or 10 weeks. It's very similar. I didn't really notice much difference between that and what I'd been doing. It was interesting to see that it was, I see some subtle differences, but it wasn't anything real significant.
It depends on the form of Zen meditation. If they're having you do koans, it might feel a little different. But shikantaza, I think that's probably what they taught you, which is just kind of a
breathing.
Breath. Yeah. I'm not a Zen expert by a long stretch.
Yeah.
But so let me ask you one last question, and then beyond this, we can just either let you go, or if you feel I've missed something, we can talk about that. But how well does mindfulness is all about non-judgmental awareness, seeing what arises in your mind without getting caught up in it, dispassionately, non-judgmentally, right? This is the skill that we can develop. It's our birthright, but it's a skill that we can hone.
Right.
How does that jibe with your job, which is to judge?
To judge. Well, it's a great question. You're not the first person who's asked it. I guess where I would make the distinction is that the judging of my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own reactions gets in the way of my being able to see the situation as it is. That what I'm kind of looking for is as clear a view of what I'm being asked to think about as I can possibly get. And I want to get the clutter of my own stuff out of the way. Once I've done that, I still have a job of trying to analyze what it is I'm seeing and say, well, does this have any legal significance? Or if I'm evaluating who's telling the truth, or I'm trying to decide whether a situation that I'm being presented with falls under a particular set of case law or something that I have to follow. So I still have to go through an analytical process. And if it's a situation where I'm being asked to exercise some discretion, like I'm trying to decide should I give somebody probation or send them to jail, or how long should I send them to jail for, or that kind of thing. I still have to do that, but I'm bringing less of my own baggage when I do it. Which is not to say, I'm still me, and I still have all of the strengths and weaknesses that I have as a human being, but there's less extraneous clutter. That's the way I would put it. It's like I can look at it and say, wow, this case is really hard, but let me try to think about this. Let me try to unpack it, and I'm just much better able to do that if I'm not dealing with my own inner voices,
Yeah. That was beautifully articulated, and I think it really speaks to one of the fears that people have about meditation, which is that they're going to be rendered into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. They'll be ineffective. They won't have any edge. But the point is not to make you unable, incapable of making decisions. The point is that you can make decisions. You can have enough non-judgmental awareness of your emotional churn so that you can let it go when you come to make a decision. Precisely.
And I caricatured it in that way before I'd ever done it. I remember thinking about it when I was a college student because, I was studying this stuff. And I said, you can meditate and, you can be all, blissed out and everything. But, what happens when, there's an injustice going on in the world? Or what happens when there's a situation that requires you to deal with it? You need to engage. You need to do something, and I think that was a caricature. That was a mistake on my part in how I thought about it. That it isn't about. Some people want to go, sit on a mountaintop and bliss out for weeks at a time. But
I would love to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to do that too, but I'd like to do that by choice.
Yeah. Right.
rather than that sort of being everything. That I think you. I have 2 children. Being a dad, being a spouse, being a judge, being grandfather, all of that. The more presence I have, the more I can give of myself for those things, and still have plenty of emotions. But it's I think the idea that you can decide that you have some consciousness about it, and you can think about how you want to express the feelings that you're having instead of it just being, whatever imprint you have from your childhood or, traumas that you had in your life. I think that's an important difference. It's an important kind of space you get from this. And so I think the idea that you're disconnected and detached is a caricature. I don't think it's true.
Agree.
Yeah.
Your Honor, you've done a great job. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask? Anything you want to talk about that you feel I didn't give you the opportunity to talk about?
Let me think about that for a second. I guess the only thing I want to add, and it's just something I'm careful about because it is my job. I have a national constituency. I mean, varieties of people who have many, many different viewpoints and many, many different jobs that they do, and there's a wide variety of people that I serve. I always talk about these things as being a tool in the toolkit. That it's not that everybody has to do A, B, or C. That people come to different things at different points in their lives. I mean, sometimes people come to completely different things than other people. But I feel as an educator that it's very useful to put this tool out there, that it's something that can help people in the judiciary be better at what they do. If people choose not to do it, if people choose to do something else, if people choose to do nothing, and that's their decision. That's something that I respect. And I think I just wouldn't want anyone to have the impression that somehow there's a intent here to spread gospel to people,
right.
Because I don't think that's appropriate, and I also don't think that's what we're doing.
Well, you're on a podcast called 10% Happier, so we don't
yeah,
believe
yeah.
in silver bullets here.
Yeah.
And I think you stated well that this is a practice that is simple, secular, largely scientifically validated. It's not going to solve all of your problems,
right.
But it's right there and available to you, and it's worth considering. I think I took that to be your message, having read your article.
Absolutely. No, I think you took the message correctly. That was exactly what the message was.
Judge Fogel, thank you very much.
Thank
really,
you.
Really appreciate it.
Well,
It was a pleasure to meet you.
Thanks for having me. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this.
Good luck getting this out there to some of the most important people in our society.
Thank you.
Okay, there's another edition of the 10% Happier podcast. If you liked it, please make sure to subscribe, rate us, and if you want to suggest topics we should cover or guests we should bring in, hit me up on Twitter at Dan B. Harris. I also want to thank heartily the people who produce this podcast and really do pretty much all the work. Lauren Efron, Josh Cohan, Sarah Amos, Andrew Kalb, Steve Jones, and the head of ABC News Digital, Dan Silver. I'll talk to you next Wednesday. Hey, Prime members. You can listen to 10% Happier early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today. Or you can listen early and ad-free with Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts. Before you go, do us a solid and tell us all about yourself by completing a short survey at Wondery.com/survey.